Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the first webinar in our new series of the EUROCONTROL Stakeholder Forum, which aims to bring together the wider aviation community to discuss how to build European aviation back better after COVID-19. Let me start by introducing myself. I'm Philip Hughes. I'm Head of Stakeholder Management in EUROCONTROL, and my hope today is that EUROCONTROL can facilitate a conversation among stakeholders as to how aviation can build better and what it will look like after COVID-19. So why is this discussion important? Well, I think everybody is aware that we're living through the worst recession in the aviation industry for living memory. So therefore, I think we need to see how we can build back again. And we need to recognize that the entire value chain within the aviation industry has been severely affected by what we've seen here. So a lot of people are struggling, and really it's a dark time, I think, for the aviation industry. But I think it's important that we now plan for recovery, because recovery will come. And it's very important that as an industry we don't get caught in the headlights. So we need to think about where we want to get to, and we also need to prompt dialogue about how that's going to do, so we can build a consensus as an industry as to where we want to go to. So if we don't know where we're going, then the problem is you don't know when you get there. So it's very important to have a clear plan, at least how as an industry we should react. So for this webinar, we've built up a very impressive panel. I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mark Camille of Airbus, Michael van Dorst of LVNL, and Andrew Murphy of Transport and Environment, each representing a different stakeholder group and perspective. Mark will talk to us from an OEM perspective and what Airbus is doing. Michael will talk to us about how ANSPs are reacting and what they're trying to do. Andrew will talk about the sustainability agenda and climate change and what challenges aviation is going to face on climate in the future. Each speaker will start by presenting their views on what today's big question is, and that is, what will the aviation industry look like post-COVID-19? So after that, I'll open the floor for questions and answers. We've received quite a number of questions and answers in advance, and I'd like to thank people for getting that. And we will also have a Q&A on the chat function, so you will be able to ask questions as we go along, and we will try and capture those. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Mark Camille. Mark, over to you.
If you look at this other map about the restrictions, you can see that everywhere the international air traffic is limited by important restrictions. Restriction at the borders, quarantines, and so it totally prevents the air traffic to resume. And there is really an urgent need now to open the borders, to resume air travel. And we think we have solutions, and there is a unity of aviation to say we are ready to restart, and to restart safely. And to ensure that healthy passengers can fly without restrictions. And for this, we are proposing tests to replace quarantines and move on for a recovery, because the recovery is very urgent now. If you look at the global impact of this crisis on air transport, you can see that the revenues of airlines would be 50% below their previous level. You can see that close to 5 million of jobs are at stake in this industry. And what is interesting in this ATAG number is the global impact of aviation, which shows also how important is the aviation for the global economy and global society. We know that it will take some time to recover, probably 3 to 5 years. And the support of the states is critical in this phase to help us crossing the crisis and starting to recover. We have seen everywhere in the world that states are eager to help this aviation industry to cross the crisis and start recovering. But we need their support for a while, and of course we had to adapt. If you take the example of Airbus, we had to reduce by 40% our production, but at the same time we think that we have been able to maintain our capacity for future growth, or skill and know-how to prepare the future and all the challenges we will have to face as a transformation to a more sustainable aviation. But we have some good hope about the future. First, I think we can recognize that air transport is one of the safest, healthiest way of transporting people. We made a lot of communication about that, but the air treatment in the aircraft cabin is similar to the one in a surgery room. And with international agencies, ICAO, EASA, and many others in the world, we have set rules for safe travel despite the COVID, ensuring sanity measures at airport, in the air transport, to be sure that there is no contamination and people can travel safely. And what makes us also confident in the future is that the trust of passengers is still there. This is one of the last surveys made by Airbus, and you can see that 70% or so of users, of passengers, frequent flyers are still ready to go back to the air, to fly again, 70%. And yet the COVID crisis is still there, and even at a peak in some countries. So we can be confident in the trust of the passengers in air traffic. The second reason for confidence in the future is that we do believe that aviation has huge benefits for the economy and the society. And this will go on. You have seen the ATAG figure, more than 80 million jobs in the world are supported by aviation. It represents 4% of the global GDP. So aviation is really part of the worldwide economy. But we bring more. Aviation is connecting and uniting people, culture, business. It drives international trade. You know that 1/3 of the global value exchange in the world is transporting by air. It supports economic aid, development. It supports education. We do believe also that it eases international tension by bringing people together across culture to learn from and understand each other. And we cannot imagine tomorrow coming back to isolated countries. We do think that an open world is a better world, and aviation is a huge contribution to this global world. Similarly, aviation safeguards world peace by promoting multilateralism, diplomacy, and conflict resolution. And so a more connected world is the safest and more prosperous world. And only aviation can bring this global connectivity. And this is why we believe that there is a clear future for aviation after the COVID pandemic. Of course, one of the big challenges we have ahead of us is the decarbonization of the economy, and so the decarbonization of the air transport. And here I have to say that Airbus wants to pioneer sustainable aerospace, and we have launched recently a project for zero-emission aircraft to the horizon 2035 with 3 projects. One is a turboprop with an hydrogen hybrid turboprop engine for a range of approximately 1,000 nautical miles and a capacity of 100 passengers. Another one is a turbofan engine close to what we have today as single aircraft with close to 200 passengers and a range superior to 2,000 nautical miles. And a very new one, the blended wing body, also powered by hydrogen, because we do think that hydrogen is a fuel for the future. And for this, perhaps a totally new design will be necessary. And so you can see here that probably the flight experience could be very different in the future, but the objective of aviation remains. And with that type of aircraft, to a quite short horizon, 2035, we think we have this ambition to be able to provide this type of aircraft with zero emission at this horizon. Another thing that shall interest Michael is improving operation and the fellow fly concept. We are an innovative company, and we do think we also have to address this. And you can see here a way of using the vortex of the previous aircraft and to fly in formation like birds, but we have tested it. It can reduce emission up to 10%. And so we also think that this is a new way of flying, especially on long distance, over the seas, over the oceans, that can be very interesting to experience in the near future to save fuel burn and so CO2 emission. Globally speaking, when you look at the last ATAG report, the Waypoint 2050, you can see that with the new technology we want to bring into the market and more extensive use of sustainable aviation fuel, there is a trajectory to a carbon neutral aviation. Here it is to 2060. And so it is feasible to have a totally decarbonized aviation to this horizon. And so to conclude, I would say that aviation offers irreplaceable benefits today and the promise of a sustainable transport tomorrow. Obviously, step changes, and these are big challenges, of course, are needed in the technologies and the way of flying to address this climate change issue. But this is also an opportunity to offer to the next generation new travel experiences and the pleasure and enrichment of flying in full respect of the planet. I'm sure that there will be a lot of questions about it, but this is our vision of the future. And we do think that after the COVID, aviation will be back. And it will be, of course, an opportunity to build a new aviation, a sustainable aviation for the future, with this trajectory to a decarbonized air transport. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. So, Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip. Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Mark, for your previous presentation. I think it's very interesting, and especially you mentioned already the part of the fellow fly. I think it would be perfect, so we can double the capacity of all our sectors, I would say. But let's find out. Let's find out together, I would mean. I think at the moment, well, just before pre-COVID times, sustainability and capacity were probably the hottest topics in aviation in the pre-COVID era. There was, of course, from an ANSP perspective, a limited availability of airspace, and capacity bottlenecks were all around, I would say. And that was all due to an ever-increasing demand for air traffic. And now, of course, our world has changed drastically. And the focus of our industry has changed, I think, from growth to survival. And economies around the world are hit hard, and it will take years to recover. At the same time, of course, when economies suffer, you see the airline industry suffer, you see the aviation world suffer. So there is a need for us to change things. I think what you also see will be behavioral changes of people that used to fly very often. I speak to colleagues around the world, and they say, well, you know, this video conferencing has taken a flight, and I'm sure after COVID, in a post-COVID area, I will travel about 40% less. And very often, of course, that is high yield traveling that my colleagues around the world are doing, the business people are doing, so that will definitely have an impact on the airlines as well. And of course, there is now video conferencing and all kind of other technological solutions for people to meet. But at the same time, I don't think it will all stop. I think there will be a need to travel, as Mark mentioned. There will be a need to connect people. There will be a need to improve business. There will be a need to grow your economies. And therefore, even though we have had capacities pre-COVID, we don't have capacity issues at the moment. We will need to look in our agenda to solve these future capacity problems. But, I say but, we cannot do it at the same way we used to do it before COVID. We really have to be more mindful to build another aviation built on decarbonization. But not only that, also the noise restrictions around airports. People are getting used now to this very quiet surroundings, a very quiet environment without the planes flying overhead their homes, and people will demand other things from aviation in the future. And that will also be something for Mark, I think, to work on for the next years. And that means at this moment, there is a moment to innovate. And so in the Netherlands, during this crisis, of course, austerity is a very important factor. We have to be mindful of what is happening to our customers. But at the same time, we have to keep innovating. So in the Netherlands, we chose to stay innovative, working on ReCat TBS, the recategorization of aircraft categories on ILSs. TBS means time-based separations, which will allow us to have more aircraft flying into an airport per hour. Of course, we are working on remote tower system. We have had some accessibility improvements at Schiphol Airport during low visibility procedures. Because at this moment, we have the EDCOs available to be innovative and to decrease the throughput time of true innovations. So looking at ATM in the future, this also means that we should not only challenge the way we have done aviation in the past, but we should also challenge our own leadership behavior. And I think if I look in the ATM world, of course, a lot of us are coming from a monopolistic background, I would say. And if you are from a monopolistic background, you know, the pace of change just goes a little bit slower probably than in the business systems. And that is normal. But it is something we must address. So after the last few years in LVNL, we've been busy working on the diversity of our management, diversity of our top management team, not only looking at the men and the women in the top. By now 50% of the people in the top 12 of LVNL are women, but we should also look at different backgrounds. People from an airline background, people from a government background, people from a classic sales background, just to speed up the innovation and the innovative thinking. We don't do that by ourselves. We have to do it in conjunction with our partners. We have to do it in conjunction with the Netherlands, and we have to do it, of course, in conjunction with the European Commission, which play a very, very important role during this changing world. Looking at that, the European Commission, of course, is, the states are all parts of Europe. We are part of the European ID of European Unity, and we are part of the European Commission. And having said that, our national government is also very much busy supporting airlines, supporting airports, and also LVNL to get through this COVID period. And recently, a draft Aviation Note 2020-2050 was presented, which lays the foundation for the period after the crisis. Because as I said before, and what Mark mentioned as well, aviation is not a goal in itself. It is a system that provides economic well-being, welfare of people. And as I said already, development has to be based on a balance between reduction of emission and a reduction of noise. And we have said in the Netherlands that aviation should be climate neutral by 2017. However, at LVNL we said, and at Schiphol we said the same, by the way, we want to be more ambitious and we strive to be climate neutral by 2050. And in that sense, I also embrace the CES2 Plus package. I think it really is a nice form of leadership that the CES2 Plus package looks forward to a new legislative system to help ANSPs to improve our capacity and at the same time the scalability by decoupling services, decoupling infrastructure, and decoupling data services. And I think that could be a nice start to get more competitive elements in the ANSP world and to drive change. And in that sense, I'm really happy that I have some real nice colleagues around me in the ANSP world, to mention, for instance, Eamon Brennan of EUROCONTROL, that are really driving change in this, I think, challenging time for the aviation sector. In conclusion, I think what we really need as an industry over the next few years is not only to cut costs, but also to focus on adding value. It's not only about cost cutting, it is about adding value to societies, it's about adding value to the aviation sector, and it's about adding value to the people, the communities living around the airports. And at LVNL, a few years ago, we introduced our purpose and we mentioned it, enabling aviation together. And I think now more than ever, we depend on joint efforts to rebuild a sound future for our industry. And cooperation between all those parties cooperation between all those parties, which makes their own specific contribution, is essential in order to be ready for recovery when time comes.
Thanks, Mikhail. Okay, Andrew.
Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for the invitation for this. I think it's an exciting series of webinars and an important forum for all of us to discuss what this vital sector will look like post-crisis. I won't pretend to be very good at forecasting or have particular skills to forecast how and when we're going to emerge from this crisis. And let's remember what might await ahead of us in terms of other pandemics or other natural disasters. What I'll try and do instead is maybe look at a few trends or a few factors that may influence how the sector can rebuild and how we can come back. Obviously, the most important one for us is climate change. And not only has the issue of climate change not fallen back in the middle of this COVID crisis, in some respects, it's become even more salient, even more current. Just this month, China and Japan have announced net zero targets, following Europe's lead in adopting a net zero target by 2050. We are seeing emissions start to fall in other parts of the economy outside of the COVID effect. We're seeing a big uptake of electric vehicles here in Europe. We are seeing India drastically reduce its forecast for coal consumption. And all this means that in the years ahead, we're going to see climate change as a much bigger issue politically. We're going to see other sectors going through big changes in reducing their emissions. And that runs the risk of the aviation sector itself being left exposed if it doesn't catch up what other sectors are doing, what countries are doing. The other big trend we'd see is the relationship with governments. Especially here in Europe in the last few decades, what we've seen is an increasing denationalization, internationalization of the aviation sector, whereby we've seen flag carriers become parts of international conglomerates. We've seen this idea that the aviation sector is increasingly private owned, self-funded, and doesn't need any government support. And that sort of fed into this narrative that the sector also shouldn't be covered by national climate policies. Well, all of a sudden, these carriers, which were considered international, became very national at the height of this crisis when they went to national government seeking support. And having seen themselves to be national carriers once more and a national sector crucial for a country's economy, it's going to be very, very difficult for the sector to go back to saying it's international post-crisis when it comes to climate policy. The sector can't be international for climate policy and national when it comes to COVID recovery. And what we're going to see in a very particular way as a result is we're going to see the aviation sector increasingly covered by climate targets. We're seeing it included in Europe's net zero 2050 target. We're going to see it included in national targets. We're going to see it included in countries outside of Europe. We're also going to see much more government intervention in the aviation sector. The government's going to become a bigger stakeholder, a bigger shareholder. It's going to have more of a role in the direction of the aviation industry. And that's a big change from recent decades where governments have really been stepping back in the aviation sector. The next relationship is going to be with investors. The aviation sector has at times, because of its tight profit margins, struggled to be such an attractive investment opportunity. And climate change and COVID are only going to exacerbate that trend. Not only is COVID putting in doubt future revenue and passenger growth for the sector, but climate change is putting in question, demand from passengers themselves. We've seen this from some trends in Nordic countries on fleet scam. But importantly, an increasing share of investment is going to be directed towards decarbonization efforts, green investments. We're seeing this here in Europe with the development of a taxonomy of sustainable investment. And it's obvious for some sectors like energy, cars, buildings, what counts as sustainable investment and what the opportunities are. It's less clear in the aviation sector what sustainable investment in aviation looks like. And as a result, the sector is going to struggle to attract that sort of sustainable investment. And as a result, it's going to struggle to attract investment overall. This is a serious threat and problem the sector will have to face up to. So why is it that the sector is perhaps not as well prepared for climate change as other sectors? Why isn't it in a position to take advantage of sustainable investments, sustainable growth? A few weeks ago, ATAG, the Air Transport Action Group, published a report called Waypoint 2050, talking about 2050 as a waypoint towards eventual net neutrality. It's an excellent report. I recommend anyone with an interest in this issue go out and read it. It details the challenges, it details the opportunities. But one line in the report really struck me, and it's the line which said, unlike most other sectors, aviation does not yet have readily available solutions for its climate challenge. And I think it's worth pausing for a second and asking, why doesn't the aviation sector have these solutions available to it? Because if you look at what the aviation sector has available to it has enormous R&D budgets, perhaps bigger than many other sectors. It attracts, I think it's fair to say, the best and brightest engineers, and researchers, and scientists who come to work for manufacturers and airlines and air navigation service providers. It is a very powerful, influential industry. Much of the sector has easy access to presidents and prime ministers. And despite this wealth of investment, of knowledge, of access, the aviation sector is still behind other sectors in its efforts to decarbonize. And, there needs to be some reflection as to why that is. And I think the failure hasn't been on an engineering side or a technical side. I think ultimately the failure has been on a political side. We've seen the sector adopt a particular political strategy for climate change, which has been to look international, look to ICAO level for the solution to its climate problem. And we've spent now 10, 20 more years going to ICAO and looking for a single global solution, which will provide a silver bullet to aviation's climate impact. That drive, the political drive, has come sometimes not even from Europe, but Europe has been okay to follow that political drive, be it coming from lobbyists in the US, or be it coming from officials in Montreal who've told us that this must be regulated at international level. I think what's exciting about the announcements by China and Japan this month about net zero targets is it shows a new path to climate action. Europe established a net zero target for its economy and was followed by other countries. I think Europe, in addressing the climate impact of its aviation sector, needs to move forward and have other countries follow it. And a good aviation policy here in Europe is a good international aviation climate policy. So what is it that we want to be going forward? I think first is, recognition by everyone that climate change is a growing concern. But to be honest, I think we have that for most people I speak to in industry. Certainly a big change in the last few years. I think what we need also is a recognition that governments are going to be much more involved in the aviation sector and need to be much more involved in addressing the climate impact of the aviation sector. The aviation sector can't unilaterally decarbonize all by itself. No sector can. There's going to be more government involvement. And finally, that government involvement is going to happen at a European level, not an international level. I think if we can accept those principles, if we can follow those trends, I'm hopeful, especially from what I've been hearing lately from a lot of leaders, that the sector can come back more sustainable. And at T&E, we're very eager to play our role in that objective. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, so I think, we've had some really interesting thoughts there in terms of how things are changing. I think there seems to be a consensus that we need to be moving towards a decarbonized aviation sector. The thing that strikes me from listening to the speakers is we're coming from a very bad place. We have an industry that's very badly hit. As Andrew has said, a number of airlines are on life support from government systems. And we have a kind of a lack of clarity about how we can actually get to this decarbonized aviation sector piece. So what I'd like to ask each of the panelists is, what one policy change would you like to see to move us in the direction of this sustainability? And Mark, I'll start with you because, I'm sure I've seen the hydrogen paper from the EU and so on. So what would Airbus like to see happening in terms of making that vision real?
Well, first, thank you very much. First, of course, this is the industry to lead this transformation to a fully decarbonized aviation. And as Airbus, we have the feeling that we need to take responsibility. I've seen the ambition we have to be the first to implement in the market decarbonized aircraft by 2035. For this, we will multiply our efforts in research and technology despite the COVID. So this is a very strategic decision to keep on developing research But everything that has been said, that we cannot do anything else, because as the other mode of transport, at the global economy, aviation has to decarbonize. Then I think what Andrew said is very important. Of course, each individual company can go in this direction, but at the same time, we need some kind of global policy, a level playing field, and EU will have its role to play. It's not only by implementing regulations, but support research, implement incentives. If you look at sustainable aviation fuel, I think there is an opportunity to have incentives to develop this solution on short term for aircraft. And we have the opportunity also with ICAO. ICAO is some kind of global governance of the aviation sector, and they have the responsibility of the environmental policy. What they did on noise was successful with successive regulation and reducing the noise of aircraft. And we need the same for CO2 emission. And the what is opening now, the discussion on long-term aviation goal in ICAO, with objective to have a decision in the assembly. So with 193 states in 2022 will be a very important step towards sustainable aviation. And what Andrew said about China going in the direction of carbon neutral should help indeed to have this level playing field with a global objective on decarbonization. But this is true that there is what the industry can do, and we take our own responsibility, but also there is a need for the global governance of the aviation sector, and we have it at ICAO level to give ambitious objectives to encourage globally the decarbonization of the sector.
Thanks, Mark. Mikhail, from an ANSP point of view, what would you like to see in terms of policy changes to help? You mentioned SES legislation before, but what would you see as being the biggest?
I think, as you mentioned rightly so, we have seen SES legislation before, and I think it was not as successful as we would have hoped. And I think that was partly driven by the fact and the idea that the change was driven by change of institutions, institutional changes. And that turned out to be very difficult in Europe, politically, especially. There was, of course, the ambitions of a country. There were civil aviation ambitions in the country. There were military aviation ambitions. And of course, it turned out that institutionally, it was very difficult to change aviation. When I was a first officer on the 737 at KLM Royal Dutch Airlines, when I flew from Amsterdam to Zurich, I think we flew 15 minutes longer than we should do if we would have a great circle flight. And I think at today it is still almost the same, where some things have been reached. But what I see now at the moment, I see it in SES2 Plus package, and I see it also in CSAR 3, which is being worked on very hard. I think now the change is driven, or the focus on change is driven by technology and the acceleration of the innovation. And I think that in itself is the right way forward. So do I want to see something change? No, I think a reasonable change is underway at the moment. I think that is the way forward also to inspire ourselves as an ANSP world. And we do that also via Kenzo. The Kenzo Vision 2035 is a very important factor there to inspire ourselves, take the next steps, and speed up innovation.
Thanks, Mikhail. Andrew, you've touched on some policy changes which you think are either coming down the line or are nearly upon us. Which of those do you think are the most important, and which do you think will actually push aviation towards a more sustainable future, shall we say?
I think my advice and policy is we have to do the boring stuff before we can do the exciting stuff. I think all of us are sometimes attracted by, this new fuel, this new aircraft design. What we've got to get done first for any climate policy is the boring stuff, making sure that we have the right target set, making sure that we're including these sectors like any other sectors. If you look at the innovation which comes out of other sectors, zero emission buildings, electric vehicles, the starting point for all of these was tough climate targets, which then drove that innovation. So innovation comes from making sure you get the maths right. Just to go back to Mark's point about whether it's European or international, and the need for a global approach to make sure there's no distortion. When this crisis began back in March and airlines were running out of cash, no one suggested we go to ICAO and come up with a global bailout for the airline sector so that we avoid distortions and unfair competition. So, I don't quite understand why, when it comes to needing to bail out the sector, we need one single global solution. When it comes to climate, we can have national bailouts, but when it comes to climate policy, somehow we need a global solution. And the fact is, we have been trying for decades now with ICAO to come up with a global climate policy, and it hasn't been working. And when it comes to policy, I'm a big fan of dropping things that aren't working, and ICAO for decades now hasn't worked. So I'm quite inclined to move on from ICAO, draw a line under it, and really unlock the innovation which exists here in Europe, which can exist in other parts of the world to reduce aviation emissions.
You would favour a European approach rather than ICAO approach because the ICAO piece. So what kind of, just as in broadly, do you see it as an ETS mechanism or something similar to CORSIA, or do you see what tools do we have out there that might help us in that discussion?
I think there's a huge focus on fuels lately. I think for the right reason, and I'm happy to talk at length why I think fuels are the approach to go. They're at a certain level of technology readiness. They can be dropped into the aviation sector without changes to aircraft design or training, and they have huge economic potential. We've seen what needs to happen to make fuels work. It's more investment in R&D. It's also more production around renewable electricity, around the production facilities. This can become an economic engine for Europe. And Europe can, just like it's exported climate technology to other parts of the world, it can start to export aviation decarbonization technology to other parts of the world. We need to start looking at this as some sort of burden we're placing on Europe. We need to look at this as a huge economic opportunity. Other parts of the world will want to decarbonize their aviation sectors as much as we do. Other parts of the world appreciate the aviation sectors, wants the aviation sectors to decarbonize. Let's become the continent that has that technology and that investment, which allows our partners around the world to decarbonize too.
Thanks, Andrew. Mark, can I go back to you? The two things there's a kind of group of questions which are coming in, which is, first of all, in terms of, given the uncertainty around the marketplace, what Airbus's view in terms of what the future demand for aircraft is? And secondly, to go back to a point which Andrew raised, how do you think investors will continue to buy new aircraft in a situation where you have a very, shall we say, strong downturn in the aviation industry? What's Airbus's view on that?
Thank you, Philip. To come back on Andrew's last intervention, I think we don't have to oppose Europe and ICAO. We did both. And if Europe can go faster, that's excellent. But at the end of the day, we will need a global approach if we want to really decarbonize aviation. So we do think we need both. Regarding the demand, first, we can see that the demand still exists. Then, the last generation of aircraft, for Airbus, the 320neo and the 350, they reduce fuel burn and CO2 emission by 20-25%. So there is a direct economic benefit for the airlines, and there is also a very strong benefit for the environment. And the next generation after, with this ambition of having this zero emission aircraft, will bring other benefits and so on. So I think if you consider that there is a global market for aviation, and what I said at the beginning, that we do think that now aviation is part of the world, of an open world and open economy, and to the benefit of the exchange and cultures and so on, there is a market, and the progress we can achieve will first give confidence in the investors. The fact also that we are going toward a sustainable aviation, because of course investors are looking for a sustainable economy, should allow us to keep the investor on board, and then the benefits bring by each new generation of aircraft is creating its own market, because the benefits is such that if you don't have this last generation of aircraft, you lose the competition. So we do believe that this existing generation of aircraft has been and will continue to be very successful, and we do believe also the future generation will have the same success on the market.
Thanks, Mark. Going to you, Mikhail, focusing on the ANSPs, we've a couple of questions here, which I would summarize by saying, how do you expect major changes within the ANSPs, particularly given your financial position in terms of severe losses? Do you envisage that there would be consolidation through ANSPs? Or what kind of fundamental changes do you think that's going to happen? I mean, if I was an airline, for instance, we've seen consolidation at airline level, but it never seems to happen at an ANSP level. What's your views on that?
I think it has happened a bit. You can see it in Africa, the NIME area. It has happened also at the MUAC area, over at the Netherlands, parts of Germany and Belgium, the higher airspace. But I agree with you, it was not very successful, as successful as it should have been. And I think that's why I refer to the institutionalized efforts that we have tried over the last 25 years. They turned out to be very difficult regarding the situations of sovereignty of airspace overhead states. So it turns out that this is very, very difficult. So at the same time, that's why I like the SES2+ approach. The fact that we strive for innovation, that we try to do it differently, delayer the services from the infrastructure part and the data services part, that will make I think the foundation of making the ANSP world more competitive. And then it will also offer the opportunity for ANSPs to control flights over other areas. So I think we have tried the institutionalized way over the last 25 years. Now we're going to go for the technological way. I think that is the way to improve. That is mentioned very correctly, is that all the ANSPs are suffering, just like other parties in the aviation industries. At LVNL, I think at the end of the year, we will have at least 50% less income. So we were lucky to have the Netherlands, the state of the Netherlands support LVNL, and so we were able to keep up our investments to make sure that we come out better in the future. Less noise for people in the surrounding area, or for instance Schiphol, and less emission as well due to different flight patterns. So there is always still, even though we have to take things internationally and on a European and ICAO level, I fully agree with what Andrew and Mark said. There is also a role of the state to keep investing, especially in those days, support the ANSPs to be able to drive this innovative agenda that we all need in the world, because capacity, COVID is an issue, aviation capacity in the longer run is an issue, but the biggest challenge we're all facing is the climate change challenge.
Okay, thanks, Mikhail. Andrew, just going back to you, one of the things that strikes me about, and I've seen the ATAG report, is that everything is predicated on everything being sorted out by 2050. But if I look at the near term, if I look at the kind of societal pressures which we've discussed, there doesn't appear to be anything, to go back to your point about aviation doesn't seem to be able to do a lot in the short term. For instance, if I look at hydrogen, that's 2035, if I read Mark's presentation correctly. What can we do in the meantime, in your view, in terms of, like, for instance, will synthetic and biofuels be a kind of a bridge towards the future, or where do you see where governments in particular might target in terms of trying to make us more efficient?
Sure. I mean, so let's be honest about the problem we have. We haven't acted fast enough or timely enough on this issue, and so we're quickly running out of time. The IPCC says we need to halve emissions in the next 10 years globally to avoid an increase in emissions of 1.5 degrees. So we're really behind time, and so that's the mentality we need to have. That actually we're already out of time, and we're a few years over the clock. So yes, we need to develop a long-term solution to aviation's climate impact. I believe that's fuels. We believe that's fuels. It will take time to scale them up. We believe significant uptake can come in the 2030s. if we start now, and by now I mean this year. We need the EU to publish its legislation for the Refuel EU initiative for alternative fuels. But if these fuels are only reaching a substantial uptake in the 2030s, what does the sector do for the next 10 years to prove its climate credentials, to cut emissions? And I think it's got to be a lot of things. Where we are in a climate emergency. The European Parliament has said we are in a climate emergency, and what you do in an emergency, you kind of pull on all the levers. I do think we need to see the COVID crisis as an opportunity to retire some of those older aircraft, and by retire, I mean retire, not put them to other parts of the world. I do think we need to look at reducing demand. All those who are engaged in a lot of business travel, institutions like Eurocontrol even, and companies even like Airbus should look at how much business travel is needed post-crisis to really bring about immediate reductions. We need to give it a short-haul route. We need to look a lot more at the non-CO2 effects of aviation, which we know can equal or exceed the CO2 effects of aviation. And it's a complex topic because it's different. There are different non-CO2 effects, and there's some uncertainty around the exact non-CO2 effects, but we know they're there. But there's also an emerging consensus as to what can be done. We can start rerouting aircraft, even tomorrow, to avoid some parts of the atmosphere which have a greater non-CO2 effects. Essentially, we need to act like we're in the crisis that we're in, and we need to realize that having wasted, 20 or 30 years, we can't waste any more years following false solutions or expecting someone else to solve the problem.
Thanks, Andrew. Again, we've a couple of other questions here, mostly in relation to the whole business of supports. I think a lot of people are concerned about the, probably because of the state of the industry, and I think there's a general recognition that government investment and support is required. I've two questions really to all the panelists. One is in relation to what level of investment do you think governments need to make? And if they are either whatever means through either fuel or revenue or direct investment, what is it they should be focusing the investment on? So Mark, over to you first.
Yes, thank you. As I said, we will increase largely our effort in research. Today, the rule at EU level and national level is 50-50. So the level of investment coming from government and the level of investment coming from industry is the same, 50-50. So we still need to work together. If we multiply by 2 our effort investment, states are multiplying by 2. And this is what is needed to achieve, or even by 4 in some cases, to reach the objective we have. As Andrew said, now we are in some kind of a race. And by the way, we decided to jump directly to this generation of zero emission aircraft because we think there is this emergency. And this is also to limit the global investment in new technology, that we need to jump directly to a future generation of aircraft which is zero emission. And so I think investing in R&D technology, when we go hydrogen, we know that also it's a global ecosystem for hydrogen. And if we have decided to go in this direction, it's because we are following the evolution of hydrogen for several years in Hydrogen Council, and we can see that a lot of other industry will go in this direction. And so governments has to invest in this new, it's not really a new energy, it's a new way of stocking and using energy through hydrogen, a green hydrogen, of course, which means that they have to invest first in production of green energy, then on the stocking and the distribution of this energy through hydrogen, and then the industry can build a new ecosystem as new aircraft using hydrogen. So you can see it's a global new ecosystem, and a decarbonized economy is really a new global system, including first the production of green energy, then the transportation and use of this green energy, and then the adaptation of all individual sectors to these new ways of using energy. And this is a global transformation we have to manage together, each having its responsibility to develop. But so we can't, it's not only a financial support we need, it's a global view and global strategy, global policy to develop in the framework of this decarbonized economy, what is necessary for transport. I visited a few weeks ago an hydrogen coach in Luxembourg, which is part of this new system. and it's already running, working, carrying people. So things are moving, and we need really the governments having a global view and giving the right place to each individual industry or mode of transport.
Just while I have you there, Mark, I have two other questions just coming in here. One is in relation to the actual production of hydrogen. People are saying perhaps that, you know, it's 150% of the energy consumed to give you the hydrogen which you need. Are you saying that it's predicated on having renewable energy systems to support it in the first place? Is that the point?
Yes, of course, this is very important. Today, aviation is using 1.6% of the global energy produced or used on the Earth. So we are not the major industry using energy. And we can see that the green energy has been multiplied by 4 in the last 5 years. And so, of course, we will depend, and this is what I said before, on the capacity of the governments to deploy green energy in the future, and at which speed, at what pace they can do it. And of course, we are representing a very little part of it today, but we hope that at the end of the day, there will be enough production of hydrogen. I said it's not only for aviation, could be for trucks, could be ships, and so on. So we need a massive development of this industry, production of hydrogen. It's very important that states, governments are investing in this sector. Today, we are a very little part of it. Perhaps our part tomorrow will be larger, but we do expect and we trust the governments. If they consider hydrogen, you have seen the declaration of several governments on that, and globally there will be a European plan on hydrogen, and we can see it in Japan, in other places. So we do believe that there will be a real dynamic on developing hydrogen. I think we do believe in innovation. The way to find hydrogen is everywhere on the Earth. It's in the air, in the water, and in the ground. And probably there will be a lot of innovation to capture and deliver green hydrogen. We do believe that this is also a new era for innovation to develop around the hydrogen, a global industry, in the way it is produced, in the way it is distributed. But this is a big challenge. We don't say other thing on that.
Okay. Michael, again, from an investment point of view, you've mentioned SES2 and SESAR, SES or SESAR 3, which, as we know, is going through at the moment. It strikes me, though, that first of all, from an investment point of view, the pot of money is going to be much smaller in a post-COVID environment. What level of support do you think ANSPs need from governments, given their, first of all, their precarious financial situation, and even though there's some capacity in the system, quite a number of them are laying off. A number of ANSPs now have made recent announcements about laying off significant numbers of people. So what kind of supports do ANSPs need in order to be fit for purpose?
Well, I think, first of all, there's an interesting dynamic going on in the aviation world at the moment, because in the initial proposal of the European Commission on the present RP3, it was a total focus on cost reduction. And I understand that because there is a lot of pressure from the airlines, of course, to reduce the cost of ANSPs, and rightly so. Has been going on for years already, and of course now there is a momentum, I would say, to push forward. So the European Commission has really dug into a cost-focused strategy towards the ANSPs. However, what you see happening now is that the cost structure of ANSPs, a lot of costs are fixed costs. So if we want to get rid of, let's say, 20% of the cost of the ANSP, the first thing you will see happening is that ANSPs will stop investing in new technologies. So if we want to do something, I think we have to put our KPIs, our key performance indicators, and we have to make sure that they will be delivered on value creation. So it's not only about the cost of a system, because ANSPs, we are infrastructure, right? So it's also about the value the infrastructure creates and for the countries it's working for. So I think the three levels that these KPIs should focus on are actually emission reduction, reduction of noise, and capacity, because there will be increase of demand for air travel after this crisis. So emission, noise, capacity, those are the three things we should invest in.
So, Mikhail, just then focusing on some of those enablers. I mean, one of the things we've seen, and it's again appearing on some of the questions here, is around we have a large amount of duplication of infrastructure in Europe, CNS infrastructure, because of the way the nation state, et cetera, Two questions really. One is, do you think the ADSP model offers some opportunities to try and consolidate and rationalize some of those? And secondly, can you just talk to me about the role of the military in all this?
So the first question, the answer is yes. Very short. I think there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity then, but it also requires us as ANSP's leaders to embrace those kind of business models. And I think there's an opportunity. I see a lot of brave leadership popping up all over Europe and all over the world, actually, and we should take this momentum. So that's an important one. The other thing is the military, as you mentioned correctly. Military demands are changing. If I look at the fifth generation jet fighters at the moment, they require more airspace. We have an airspace redesign project at the moment in the Netherlands, and the Netherlands have bought the F-35. So it requires more airspace, which also places in a constrained airspace like the Netherlands is. It places high demands on the ANSP's performance, and it also has an effect on the direct routing. If the military needs a bigger airspace, of course, we have to reroute some of the planes which normally go via great circle routes. So it is something you really have to do together with the military, and that's why in the Netherlands, about 2 years ago, we decided we will combine the ANSP of the military, and we will combine it, and we will bring it towards LVNL, our company, my company, and we will have one ANSP in the Netherlands, so we can just make better use of flexible use of airspace and all the challenges I just mentioned.
Thanks, Mikhail. Andrew, I wanted just to touch base. People have been talking about on the line here, I'm looking at the questions about where aviation positions itself in terms of communications. If I look at other sectors, my impression is they do a better job about communicating what the value is for those particular sectors. What do you think aviation has to do in terms of communicating and getting its message across?
Well, look, I mean, that's a very difficult question. I see a lot of aviation communications, and I don't think it's so bad. I watched last night the promotional video for the Airbus Zero E that Mark has mentioned a few times, and maybe I'm not the target audience for this, and maybe Mark will think I'm just a very cynical and skeptical person. So hence, I will say I wasn't very convinced, and. I'll tell you why I wasn't convinced. I wasn't convinced because I think it lacked a little detail and a little assurances that we're going to get from a promotional video to an actual aircraft in 2035. Hydrogen, there's a thing called hydrogen hype. It's been around since the 80s, people talking about hydrogen. We've been talking about hydrogen aircraft now for 20 years. Airbus came out with a similar proposal 20 years ago. If I'm the target audience, if Mark is trying to convince me, what can he do to convince me? And there's two things they can do to convince me if I am sort of the target here. The first is money. Hydrogen aircraft are not going to be cheap. The A380 itself costs 15 to 20 billion. The Moon program costs $200 billion in today's terms. It's going to cost a lot of money. And last night in the promotional video, one of the Airbus executives was asked, how much is it going to cost? He didn't really give an answer. 3 years ago, Volkswagen, who T&E battles with a lot on diesel, came out and said, we're going to put 60 billion into electric vehicles. And we welcomed that because we actually wanted the numbers, the maths, the details behind the announcements. The second thing we can do is support tough climate policies. When Volkswagen said they would put 60 billion into electric vehicles, we knew that would work because the EU at the same time came along and brought in stronger CO2 standards for cars. If we want to be convinced, if the communications has to work, the policies behind the communications have to be credible. I'm open to seeing zero-emission aircrafts as a possibility, but there needs to be a lot more commitment from the industry itself in terms of money, and also what the industry is saying as a technology needs to align with the lobbying it is doing. And I think to give one good example of that, I've mentioned it before earlier on, the EU's taxonomy of sustainable investment. So taxonomy, not a very exciting term, but basically it's a list of what counts as sustainable investment. We think the only thing that should be considered a sustainable investment for aircraft is zero-emission aircraft, nothing else. Because at the end of the day, we need billions of euro to go into these aircraft to make them work. Actually, what we're seeing is a campaign that sustainable investment shouldn't just be zero-emission aircraft. It should also be regular aircraft that are, 5 or 10% more efficient. What struck me from the ATAG report, and you should read it because I keep referencing it. It's great. They had this fantastic statistic in there that in the last 10 years, $1 trillion was spent on new aircraft. It's an enormous sum. And so the question is, if we're at the start of a new decade now, so do we have another decade of $1 trillion investment in the same type of aircraft we've had for decades now? Or do we start steering some of that investment away from just building the same type of aircraft, and we start putting it into this zero-emission aircraft? $1 trillion is a lot. You take a chunk of that, and you can't actually get a hydrogen aircraft out of that $1 trillion. But we need to start putting the money in the right place. I don't think there is going to be a shortage of cash. I think the IMF have come out and said now is the time to spend. I think it's a much bigger political understanding that actually we need to kind of loosen the purse strings and invest. We have the productive capacity. But we need to make sure the productive capacity is going in the right direction. And when you have the policies right, the communication follows after that.
Thanks, Andrew. So, Mark, have we got some heavy numbers around this, and what's your view on the points Andrew raised?
Well, I understand the question coming from Andrew. I think they are legitimate questions. We understand some skepticism about what we have announced 2 weeks ago. It was really new. Of course, we can take the challenge of convincing Andrew. Anyway, the objective is not to convince you. It's really first to move on, because we think we have no choice to move on to a decarbonized aviation. So I think all this company, Airbus, is committed to move on toward the fully decarbonized aviation, and of course dialogue. We are open to the dialogue. We don't have all the answer and solutions today, but what we are convinced it's really time now to move on to this future generation of decarbonized aircraft, and so we are engaging all the company in it. We know that there is some difficulties ahead, and we will address it. We are also confident in the capacity of this company to address all these challenges, from the production of green energy to the delivery of a green aircraft. So let's just say keep on discussing it, bringing solutions to the questions in the near future, because we are engaged now really in total transformation. And of course, we are very happy to exchange with Andrew and the others. Good to be challenged also. So these are good questions and help us to progress. But it's not only a question of trust, confidence. It's really a need. We need to understand the evolution of the society, and we need to progress. And we think this is what we are doing, not only Airbus alone, but if you look at ATAG, what is interesting in this report is the report of the whole aviation industry. And you have a roadmap to net zero in 2060 coming from this report. So probably we still have some progresses. I will report probably some are listening to you, to our com team, said they have still to be better to convince Andrew. But I do think that we are on the right track with a lot of difficulty, challenges, and through the dialogue that is now starting, especially in Europe, with all stakeholders, including important organization and TNE, we will find a way forward, because we have no objections to a decarbonized aviation. So let's keep on discussing it after.
Thanks, Mark. I'll definitely have to add the old ATAG report to my reading list now going to bed, because everybody seems that's the way which we have to go. So we'll do this. So we've had a couple of questions around the issue of airports. So, Michael, I just want to talk about There's some specific things in relation to very few airports using CDO, CDA, and what I know you've with LVNL, you've one of the biggest airports in the world. So what's your views in relation to what airports can do, speaking as an ANSP, about how they can help in terms of this whole both sustainability and in terms of recovery, because they're also in a very bad place. I saw some numbers last week saying they're going to lose 400 billion in revenue or something. What's your view on that?
Well, I think there's a lot of challenges also for the airport, as you mentioned, also financially. But what airports also could do is make sure that the infrastructure is there to provide what I would say green fuels or fuels that have less carbon emission. So there could be a role infrastructurally for airports to make available greener fuels. And be able to mix it in the present systems if so the fuel based on algae or whatever. So I think that should be a major role for airports, and also inform the people, because what I notice, of course, the ANSPs, we are B2B, we are business to business companies, and people know air traffic control, but people in the Netherlands hardly know LVNL. They all know the brand Schiphol. They all know what Schiphol stands for. So I think in that sense, they can use their communication skills to address the people, to be environmentally active, I would say, to be environmentally aware. Maybe even just like what Peter Elbers did, I think already a year ago, if you fly responsibly. So don't fly for every occasion, fly responsibly, take your commitment to society and the climate. And I think it's the same thing. If you take responsible for the climate, you take responsible for society. Take it seriously, and that's a part of communication we have to ingrain in I think all the citizens around the world to make sure that we have a nice, bright future together.
Thanks, Michael. We're coming to the end of this session. I've tried to capture as many questions as possible, which are, to be fair to people, are coming in very quickly online. So if we haven't addressed them here, we'll try and respond to you later again. So just in terms of wrapping up this session, my kind of main takeaways from this is that if I look at Mark's presentation, the OEM, there's obviously a lot of work going on in terms of moving towards disruptive aircraft performance, but obviously it needs significant investment. And I think that's going to be an issue. I think Andrew quite correctly pointed out we have to put a number on that. I think there's some really interesting other stuff which is going on, like fellow flight, which I think we need to try and leverage as much of that as we possibly can. So I think it's important. On Michael's side, the ANSP side, I think Michael was clear that we need to use this crisis as an opportunity. We need to reform and push for the implementation of SES, and perhaps look at consolidation opportunities to reduce the fragmented nature of our industry, because we can't keep on doing it the same way. Andrew raised quite a number of interesting points, and as I say, I will definitely be printing down the ATAG report after this, but what I found interesting was the relationship between the sector and governments upended by the crisis. And that's just going beyond the whole issue of increased ownership of airlines by governments. So I think the sector will struggle to justify its exclusion from climate laws and target this while at the same time requesting national aid. I think there's something around that whole dynamic that's now changed. And I think as an aviation industry, I think that's something we're going to do, because in my view, if you look at the numbers, it'll struggle economically for some time and it'll need public money to decarbonize. Okay. So at this stage, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to the panel of speakers. I think this forum could have gone on for another hour quite comfortably, but I think it was a really stimulating and interesting webinar. So I hope all of you found it interesting, and maybe it'll stimulate some ideas on how we can build back better together. So as I say, here in Eurocontrol, we believe our role is to facilitate the discussion. We want to provide independent thinking about this, and we want to help the industry. We believe it's really important to build a narrative about what we do. Nobody has all of the answers to this, and we need to ask the questions about what we're going to do, because this is going to be a difficult and a long conversation. So to that end, we want to continue the conversation. So we've organized a number of other webinars now before Christmas, the first of which is on the 27th of November. And we're actually going to explore the sustainability issue in a lot more detail. This session will be hosted by Marilyn Bastan, who is our head of sustainability, and she'll be going into a little bit more detail on some of the issues which were raised today, because we think it's very important. So all the details are on our website, and it only remains for me to say then just to thank all our panelists again, and to say thanks to everybody for contributing. I think we will also be posting a copy of the Airbus presentation on our website, so you can get a copy of that. So it only remains for me to say to everybody, please stay safe, stay strong, and stay positive, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you again.